St. John the Philosopher here. As always, I managed to offend a couple of liberals the other day with my commentary. And while the reactions weren't surprising, they are valuable as perfect examples of the problems with the thinking on the left. Thanks for the content, guys. As most, or hopefully all of you should know, I have a regular weekly guest spot on the Andy Frey Show on 97.1 FM Talk here in St. Louis. During one of my latest appearances, the conversation took me back to the 90s, when I feel as though race relations were in a much better place than they are today. And I gave a humorous example of what I meant. Soon after, a call came in from a listener who took offense. I won't belabor you with a full rundown of the segment, but I will link the specific timestamp of the conversation in question down in the description below, along with links to my guest spot playlist and the Andy Frey Show YouTube channel. Go subscribe. In any case, even though I wasn't really talking about code switching, that became the subject of the conversation. Now, code switching is when a person changes their speech pattern, typically to conform to the one most prevalent in their current environment. For instance, someone whose family speaks with a Cajun patois becomes more formal when speaking to customers while on the job at a local bank.
Okay.
The caller came in pretty hot with accusations of how my speech might lead to violence or how I'm misusing the responsibility of having such a large platform and all this kind of silliness. And I'd barely gotten out about 10 words of a response before she went in again. Those kinds of interruptions are a pet peeve of mine, so I'll admit my temperature was rising. But here's the situation as I saw it. A young white liberal woman, presuming that I was some random white dude on the radio, completely misconstrued my words and took it upon herself to white knight for the black community. This type of thing happens a million times a day. Leftists have been weaponizing liberal compassion for decades, and Diana is a typical example of the results. I have the impression that she has a good heart, but it rests on a set of falsehoods that inform her worldview, making her liable to stumble into all sorts of logical pitfalls. The primary one on display here is identity politics. As I said, it was kind of clear to me that she thought I was white, and white people aren't allowed to talk about black people. Well, there is a caveat, but we'll come back to that. The secondary falsehood is a skewed view of the preeminence of experiential knowledge. Now, I don't call it a falsehood out of hand because direct experience is more often than not the most accurate sort of knowledge. I know what it's like to be bullied because I was bullied as a kid, for example. But the liberal worldview tends to apply an identity component to this truth and twist it into something unrecognizable. So the black experience, or what it's like to live in the world as a black person, becomes entirely opaque to anyone of any other race. This is dumb. While race is an important factor in an individual's life experience, it's not the only factor. In fact, when you add up all of the variations that go into shaping human experience, every individual comes out with a completely singular perspective that cannot be replicated by anyone else in the history of the universe. Sure, if you made a Venn diagram, my circle of experience might have more areas of intersection with another person's, but that's where human empathy and reason come in as the two primary ways that we can understand the plight of others with whom we necessarily cannot share every experience. Leftist thinking puts people into largely immutable categories and in most instances makes the case that people in one category cannot speak on any issue if it pertains to people in another category, as though there were no lines of commonalities between people, that we are incapable of empathy, or just the intellectual exercise of applying logic to a given subject. You better stay in your lane or someone like Diana will have to check you. From Diana's perspective, it seemed code switching is an exclusively black thing. And since in her view, some white dude is talking about black things, I have violated the social requirements of her identity politics framework. Therefore, anything I say, unless it agrees with the prevailing ideological messaging of the left, must be taken as offensive. This is where you get what I call the Kathy Newman effect. It comes from a now infamous interview between British broadcaster Kathy Newman and popular Canadian psychologist and conservative commentator Professor Jordan B. Peterson. All throughout the interview, Peterson would make a statement, and Newman would respond with, "So what you're saying is," before proceeding to completely botch Peterson's position. It's hard to determine if liberals do this deliberately or if it's an unconscious function of their ideological conditioning, but it's pretty much standard operating procedure for them. At best, my commentary was adjacent to code switching, but she took it the way she did, came into the show pretty heated, almost to the point of incoherent babbling, and I had a decision to make on how I would respond. I could directly address the disrespect in her demeanor, which would have changed the subject to something personal and gotten ugly fast, or I could try to deconstruct her false premise entirely from the ground up, for which there was absolutely no time. Or I could use her worldview framework against her to make a point that pushes back against at least one part of her flawed thinking. We conservatives hate identity politics, and for good reason, but a smart conservative can leverage it when necessary in order to highlight its deficiencies. By leaning on my identity as a black man, having been raised in the ghetto, being the child of a man that lived through actual systemic racism, I disarmed Diana's outrage. Now, this doesn't always work. While leftism presents itself to liberals as an ideology built on compassion, it's really one built on power and control. So the further down the path of leftism a liberal goes, the less compassionate they get. You see it everywhere. Fortunately, there's hope for Diana, because she immediately softened and seemed to be able to absorb the message that there are many experiences within the black community that aren't exclusive to the black community, including code switching. And we can all be kind and laugh together about those areas of sameness, even while we recognize our differences. The other emblematic response I got was via Annie's Twitter feed. This dude's first comment demonstrates the Kathy Newman effect, wherein he ignores or removes context from the conversation to twist it into something it was not. And then he knocks down his own straw man argument with an assertion that relies on the same racial essentialism that fueled Diana's anger. The false idea that only black people code switch, further amplified by language that suggests some level of collective racial trauma from it, but yeah, get some therapy, bro. To piggyback off of the importance of entertainment, as I discussed in my previous video, we used to explore all these ideas in media in a way that helped illustrate them and make them relatable, allowing us to look at the real world around us with a new perspective. Consider the fish out of water trope in storytelling, where the main character is thrown into a situation where they are completely an outsider to the culture in which they find themselves. Splash, Crocodile Dundee, Big, Coming to America. Are you noticing a pattern about the time period in which these stories seem to be prevalent? Which is where this all started, but I digress. The message coming out of those stories was one that pressed upon the main character that they have to make some measure of adjustment in order to be understood by those around him, and that those around him have to provide some measure of grace in recognition of his cultural origins. In the end, the good people on either end of the cultural spectrum both bend to meet each other in the middle, because that's where the dream of America lives. But that's not the message leftists and their indoctrinated liberal foot soldiers have for us. They demand that the prevailing culture be torn down to its foundations and rebuilt, lest anyone feel like an outsider for even 1 second. I mean, imagine a white minority population in an African nation forcing the majority to conform to their own. Oh, wait, that's apartheid South Africa. Then came the inevitable accusation of tokenism, which is the ultimate stand-in for having an actual intelligent position on any issue. It's a form of ad hominem attack intended to discredit the messenger of an idea you don't like but can't really argue. The premise behind it rests on the concept of political racial determinism. The liberal left preaches that only their side of the political aisle cares about minorities, that only their ideas can help minorities. And conversely, the other side, the conservatives, are white supremacists and support white supremacist policies. This is taken as indisputable gospel, so that all new information must be processed in such a way as to ensure that it supports this premise. So when you present facts that challenge this leftist gospel, like the existence of conservative minorities, the explanation must bend to the idea that conservatism is racist. By this reckoning, it can't possibly be that thoughtful, intelligent minorities see merit and no malice in conservative thoughts. So the only remaining conclusion is some variation of either a Stockholm Syndrome situation presenting conservative minorities as brainwashed victims, or traitorous collaboration. The tokenism accusation manages to be generic enough that it covers both kinds. But in this case, after Annie read his initial 2 tweets and I responded by defending the sanctity of my own dang mind, Mr. Twitter genius here went all in on the traitor narrative, since it's the only way someone who should know better would subject himself to be used as a mouthpiece for right-wing talking points. There are not enough air quotes in existence for that last sentence. Now, have you ever noticed that this never works in the other direction? Since America is a majority white country, pretty much every portion of the political spectrum is overwhelmingly white. That's just math. So whenever a minority lends their voice to any political position, he could be said to be parroting white talking points. So why is it that when a minority is placed front and center to deliver liberal leftist messaging, no one calls them a token? The other aspect of the tokenism charge is an implication of unmerited position. If the accusation against me is you only have a platform because you're a minority, it assumes that I have no other qualifications besides my ethnicity to explain how I am where I am. But in order to get there, you'd have to ignore my intellect, my insight, my oratory, and every aspect of my unique personal story that contributes to all those things. And let's not forget, I'm pretty easy on the eyes. This is a pattern on the left. When confronted with high-level, accomplished minorities being praised and elevated by conservatives, they lose their minds. How else can you explain the fact that top performers in their fields like Thomas Sowell, Ben Carson, and Clarence Thomas can be reduced in their twisted minds to dark-skinned puppets? And yet there are questionable examples right in their own backyards of minority leftist mouthpieces whose resumes don't exactly live up to their stations. Do you think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would be pulling the same levels of clout in the Democratic Party if the freshman member of Congress was Alex O'Connor? Kamala Harris drew so little support from her own party's voters during the Democratic primaries that she had to drop out before the first vote. And yet she's now our venerable VP. And who would have imagined a mediocre freshman senator with virtually no relevant experience suddenly being elevated to the presidency? Maybe it's all just a matter of projection. That would at least be consistent for leftists. But look, the fact of the matter is that the attempts to shame conservative minorities is an unoriginal scare tactic by weak minds built on an ideology of ignorance, faulty logic, and grievance. The left doesn't actually care about racism. You can tell because they see it everywhere it isn't and ignore actual racism so long as it's directed at the right people. Leftism is a disease of the heart and mind, concerned only with the acquisition of power and control at the expense of anyone that gets in its way. So when they demand the blood of the so-called Uncle Toms, the coons, and the sellouts, just know that they're experiencing the cognitive dissonance of having to deal with a challenge to their precious ideas and simply can't handle the truth. You see, there are people living today that grew up under the real systemic racism of Democrat political control, whose children and grandchildren campaign exclusively for Democrats on the promise of government money. So tell me again, who are the sellouts? Tell me what you think of this video. Tell me about a time when you experienced the Kathy Newman effect. What other ways can you think of to help get through to liberals? Discuss in the comments. In the meantime, be sure to like, subscribe, and share for more videos of religion, culture, and politics. That's all for today. Goodbye, God bless, and we'll see you in another video.